Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's State of Trade webinar, a conversation with the Honorable Rob Portman. I'm Phil Levy, Chief Economist here at Flexport. We have a fantastic guest joining us today, but before we begin, a few procedural points. Due to time constraints, there will be no Q&A today. If at any time you need assistance during the webinar, please message us in the help chat on the right of your screen. Lastly, we will share a copy of the slide deck at the end of the presentation, and we will also email you the slide deck and a link to the recording tomorrow morning. And now, to make the lawyers happy, please keep in mind that all information provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. We have a treat today. It's been a challenging time for international trade in recent years, and shocks and supply difficulties accompanying the pandemic. And then on the policy front, there have been acts of commission and omission. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We've had tariffs applied against major trading partners, and it's been over a decade since we've had a major trade agreement expanding market access. It's hard to think of anybody who would have more insight into where we've been and where we're going and where we might go than former Senator Rob Portman. He's had an exceedingly distinguished career that has ranged from being a White House counsel to a member of the House of Representatives from Ohio, the U.S. Trade Representative to Senator from Ohio up until January. And I've admitted little side gigs like Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Senator Portman, it's really an honor and a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Bill, it's great to be on with you.
I wanted to jump right in and talk a little bit about what drives U.S. trade policy. I think for those who have not been immersed in it, it can be tempting to think that trade policy is whatever an administration or a U.S. Trade Representative decides it's going to be. As you know, as well as anyone, there's more to it than that. There's trade academics will sometimes talk about a multi-level game where you have to deal with foreign trading partners, you have to deal with members of Congress and where they stand, and you are accountable to public opinion. So what I wanted to do for this section is to ask you a bit about each one of those and where you think we are. So maybe if we could, we can start with, how would you assess the current state of U.S. international leadership on trade? Are we able to persuade those countries that we need to?
Well, I'd say the current state is one where the United States is not as engaged, Phil, as we should be. And without the U.S. leading, sometimes it's difficult to see expansions of trade, particularly freer markets, and the kinds of trade agreements that the United States traditionally has promoted are the gold standard in the sense that they reduce tariffs to zero. They ensure that there is a commitment to free trade by both partners. And you're right, it's been a long time since we've had one of those kinds of trade agreements. So part of our challenge is not so much convincing others, but convincing ourselves that it's worth getting back into the game. We negotiated an agreement with the United States and Canada and Mexico to succeed NAFTA, and it got a big bipartisan vote. And after that, I think a lot of people thought, this was during the last administration, so this is 3 or 4 years ago, that we were on track to get back into a bipartisan trade agenda. But USMCA was followed by a presidential campaign where the candidates didn't talk much about trade, and if they did, they talked about taking more protectionist actions. And then one of the candidates, candidate Biden, then Vice President Biden, said that he would make a commitment not to pursue any free trade agreements, and that's, to me, one of the huge problems with our current policy. To answer your question, which is that the United States is known as not being able to or interested in promoting trade through the traditional way, which would be through lowering tariffs on both sides with countries either multilaterally, like the U.S.-Mexico free trade agreement, or bilaterally, like the agreement with the UK, which was practically completed during the Trump administration, but not quite. So they're about 4/5 of the way there. So what I think we need to do, obviously, Phil, and I think this is not just obvious to Republicans, but Democrats alike on the Hill, is get back in the game and not allow other countries to take the markets that we otherwise would have access to.
Senator, I wanted to follow up on that point that you just made about getting back in the game. If we think about ways, and you've been the one sitting across the negotiating table from other countries, if we think about ways that we might persuade other countries as the United States, there's a traditional way where you exchange market access. There's moral suasion where you just simply say, this is the right thing to do, we should all do this together. Or there's presumably, which we've seen a little bit recently, threats, where you say, if you don't do this, we will apply tariffs, we will do some other measures. How would you compare those methods in terms of getting the U.S. to where it needs to be from a commercial standpoint?
Well, I think offering market access on both sides has always been the key. I know there's discussion about IPEF right now, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and how that could be successful. The problem is it doesn't have any teeth in the sense that it doesn't have any market access provisions. And there may be some exceptions made to that. I hope there will be over the next year and a half in this administration. But so far, it's been viewed rather skeptically by countries in the region because they aren't getting market access. So when we go to these countries, let's say talking to countries in the Southeast Asia region, say you go to Vietnam and say, we'd like to have you change your policies as it relates to labor or the environment, or open up your services environment more. And they say to us, well, okay, what do we get? And what they would get normally would be more market access, in other words, lower tariffs for some of their products coming to the United States, services or goods. But we can't offer that because it's not a market access agreement. It hasn't gone through the United States Congress. One of the probably building blocks of this conversation we should mention, and Phil, I know you're very well aware of this from your time at the Council on Economic Advisors at the White House, but Congress plays an outsized role here in our Constitution. Congress is the one that regulates the trade between countries, and so that's why there has to be what's so-called Trade Promotion Authority. The administration typically would propose that, which this administration does not. In fact, they've opposed it rather than proposing it. And then Congress, plays a big role in monitoring the trade negotiations and eventually voting up or down, yes or no, without amendment on trade agreements under the Trade Promotion Authority. So that is what's missing. And I don't think that coercion is going to get countries to engage in trade with us. I'm not against putting tariffs in place where another country is unfairly trading with us. I think that's a distinction that has to be made. The pure free traders might say, well, tariffs of any kind are bad. I don't agree with that. I believe that balanced trade is what our objective ought to be. And other countries should take the same approach, which is if you're not playing by the rules, if you're subsidizing a product or a service, or you are selling it at below its cost, which is dumping, then you should be subject to the rules, which is that, okay, we're going to put a higher tariff on some of your products until you level the playing field and be sure that workers, farmers, and service providers in both countries get a fair shake. And that was working pretty well there for a while. The United States sends about half of our exports to 10% of the world, and that 10% is where we have a trade agreement. So that was awfully good for American exporters. Now, unfortunately, we're backsliding, and my hope is that we will re-engage, that whoever runs for president next go around on either side will take another look at this and decide that the right approach for the American people, for American workers, American farmers, ranchers, service providers, and so on, is to actually provide more trade on balanced terms so the United States gets a fair shake.
That's a very interesting point. I wanted to pick up on the Congress point that you raised and what the relationships are between Congress and the executive, because this has always been a sort of interesting. You talked about Trade Promotion Authority, where Congress, I'm not aware, but I'll say delegates a degree of authority to go negotiate, because as we've got up, the Constitution is giving Congress this power. How have you've been watching and intimately involved in this for quite a while on both sides? How has that relationship changed between the executive and the legislative? And is this just crossing of T's, dotting of I's, or is this something that actually matters to the outcome?
It does matter to the outcome because ultimately, as you say, Congress has to approve the agreement. And Congress has become more discerning over time and looking for certain things. That's why there are stronger provisions as it relates to things like the environment or labor standards or currency manipulation, something that I felt strongly about, or other issues where Congress wants to play a role to ensure that we are not divorcing trade policy from other important international priorities. So Congress has a role to play. Administrations have to acknowledge that and work with Congress. And again, it's ironic that we're having so much trouble right now moving a trade agenda forward when we just completed, again, this USMCA process where for the first time in years, Phil, decades, we had not just a trade agreement passed, but passed with overwhelming bipartisan majorities. typically it's been pretty tough. As you know, I was U.S. Trade Representative, and we tried to get the Central American Free Trade Agreement through, and it was quite challenging because we were down to the last 4 or 5 votes. Same with other agreements. So there have been some that have been more bipartisan. Say Australia, where there are not labor or environment issues. At least at the time, they were not recognized. But for the most part, like the Korean agreement, so-called Chorus agreement, it was tough. Went back and forth. You recall Colombia, same thing. So we were coming off a very successful process in the sense USMCA. Did I agree with every part of the newly formed NAFTA, the USMCA? No, I would have done things a little bit differently. But overall, I knew it was good for our country, and it established a template for other agreements that should have been followed. My great disappointment is that we've dropped the ball. And again, to be that close to completing the agreement with the United Kingdom, one of, if not our greatest ally in the world, is particularly disappointing because that agreement would have been good for the United States, good for the UK commercially, but particularly good from a geopolitical point of view as they were leaving the European Union, and provided a template for us to do a broader agreement with other European countries, with the EU itself, because many of the issues that we would have to resolve with the UK and did resolve, frankly, particularly on the services side, would also apply well to the EU. That would be so strong for our position in the world to have the United States and the EU in a free trade agreement vis-a-vis other countries that are not playing by the rules, and particularly with regard to having some balance with China. So meanwhile, the EU, the UK, China, they're all pursuing free trade agreements, and the United States is missing out on some of those markets.
You held up Australia as an example of one that was not so contentious, and in part because these issues that have really vexed political debate over trade policy, like labor and the environment, didn't seem to be as relevant when you were dealing with a country that was of comparable level of development. So why didn't we conclude, or why haven't we concluded an agreement with the UK? Why has that sort of proposition that working with a major developed country should be easy not seem to pan out?
Well, my response to that will be viewed as partisan by some, but I think it's simply because the Biden administration doesn't want to do it. They will point to certain issues on the agriculture front that have not been fully resolved. I say to those concerns, well, the UK managed to complete an agreement with Australia, which has huge beef issues, just as we do with the UK. And they provided again, a template for us, an example for us as to how to resolve it. Same with New Zealand. So I don't think those issues, which are a relatively small part of trade, by the way, should have kept us from completing that final, I would say 20% of the agreement. I think we were 4/5 of the way there. Second, you've heard concerns about the Northern Ireland border and how you would deal with that, and whether that would somehow violate the carefully negotiated deal we have with Northern Ireland, which was quite sensitive and difficult. But again, other countries have figured that out. The EU obviously has to figure that out. The EU, Ireland being part of the EU. So there are ways to do that, and there are specific ways that I've spoken to UK trade officials about. I've been over there twice meeting with them. They also came over to Washington to meet with us. Senator Coons, a Democrat, and I were the co-chairs of the caucus to try to get this done. We were not successful, but meanwhile, Senator Coons, on a bipartisan basis, continues to promote this agreement. So I think that's really a function of the administration, the current administration, making a commitment not to do free trade agreements, period, and the UK completing that would violate that policy. I think it's as simple as that. I would also say that with regard to the UK, again, this is not just about the UK. It's about being able to put together an agreement that could then be used as a model example in many sectors for a broader agreement with the European Union, which would be in both of our interests and would be a good counterweight to what we see happening globally in terms of trade. More closely coordinating with Japan, with the Republic of Korea, with the EU and other countries vis-a-vis China is obviously a better way to deal with the concerns we have about China trade practices than us attempting to do it unilaterally. So I think that is a huge reason for us to get the UK agreement done and then move on from there and develop stronger alliances. By the way, Japan is interesting. Another country which has many of the same attributes as the UK and Canada in terms of not being as controversial on labor environment issues like that. In fact, we could complete an agreement with Japan, I believe. They are being more understanding about the agriculture realities, that they can't continue to be as protectionist there. That was always the issue with Japan. There, I would say it's fair to say we were about 1/3 of the way there through the phase one that the previous administration concluded with Japan. And I thought that was, again, it was teed up for a good resolution. Having completed an agreement with Japan, of course, you would have completed an agreement with by far the vast majority of the people who live in the countries that comprise the old TPP, the Trade Promotion or the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that was not pursued, and now it is, being pursued by China and others. It's a growing coalition of countries. But you think about it, of the countries in that agreement, we have agreements with many of those already. Certainly the Latin American countries on the Pacific coast, like Chile or Peru, but also with countries like Australia, like Singapore. And if we had Japan, which is by far the largest economy in that mix, assuming China does not join, we would have a trade agreement, a bilateral trade agreement with the vast majority of those countries, making it far easier for us than to have this broader multinational agreement, which would really, if done properly, also provide a counterweight to China's influence in the region.
All kinds of interesting things to pick up on there, but let me, for a moment, stick with the congressional theme. If we were to follow your advice and to try to finish dealings with the UK and then potentially with Japan, would those require TPA, or would they get a pass because they were already started? And I guess more significantly, do you think the Congress is in a position now where it would deliver a usable trade promotion authority bill?
Well, those are great questions. I think it is important to have TPA to provide the ability to be successful in completing even easy agreements, and I would put the UK in that category. I think it'll be quite popular, much as the USMCA was. But I think it's good to have the ability to have an up or down vote rather than being able to nickel and dime it through lots of amendments. So working out those issues in advance and then having a trade promotion authority type up or down vote, I think is important. Same with Japan. So I think it's important to have that cover in effect for being able to pursue the trade agreements. I also believe, though, that Congress can do this on its own. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that traditionally our administration would propose extending trade promotion authority. Again, this is the process under which trade agreements have traditionally been considered. Congress can do it on its own. Again, it goes back to the constitutional authority that's in Congress. And so one push that I was making when I was there was to say, why don't we just go ahead and come up with trade promotion authority? The president would have the choice to sign it or not, but if there was a strong bipartisan agreement, because it had something for everybody, which I think it could, in terms of what they're interested in, like labor provisions, environment provisions. Again, coming off of USMCA, we should have been, I think, more confident and optimistic about that. So I think Congress should sort of grab the bull by the horns here and move forward if the administration refuses to before it's too late.
Well, what was the answer you got when you posed that question of why don't we? I mean, this was highly contentious in 2015. You were in the middle of that.
Yeah.
Would it be easier now?
Yeah, I think it would be because of USMCA, but the answer is that the Democrats want to stick with their administration, and so whatever their position is, they're going to stick with. Not all, and I would say quietly. I've had lots of discussions with colleagues, some of whom are not as bold as Chris Coons, who agreed to co-sponsor legislation with me for TPA for not just UK, but also other countries. One approach that we had was to do one country in every region. People have talked a lot about doing an agreement in Latin America with Ecuador because they're desperate for one. All the other Andean countries of the region have one. They got left out because of their administration at the time. Now they want in. They're a great ally, great friend. The current president's a huge ally, and it would be a natural. And unfortunately, they're turning to China instead because we're leaving them out. So Ecuador, In Africa, there's been talk about various countries, but one that keeps coming up again and again is Kenya. And I think having an agreement with a sub-Saharan African country is very important. And I think Kenya would be a very good candidate for that. So do UK, Kenya, Ecuador, and then in the Asia Pacific area, there's so many good choices. One that's popular with House Democrats and Republicans, I know, is Taiwan. A trade agreement with Taiwan. But there are other countries as well in the region that would love to have a trade agreement. Vietnam comes to mind. They would love to have a bilateral agreement with the United States. So I think there would be a way with TPA this time to say, okay, people are concerned about TPA. What if we limited it just to those countries? What's the objection to doing an agreement with Kenya, as an example, which is something that a lot of the Democrats have traditionally supported. We also believed that TPA could be used to make the WTO work better, because under TPA you could change the process at the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, which has really fallen on hard times. It's become almost an appendage that is not being exercised because of the lack of support, because of some of the policies they have, including a consensus approach, meaning that all the countries have to come together, and that just isn't happening anymore. It was always difficult to get a consensus, but impossible now on so many agreements. So, for instance, on the Environmental Services Agreement, something a lot of Democrats would like to see, why not allow for a plurilateral agreement? Plurilateral means not a consensus, not everybody, but as many countries as possible coming together and agreeing, not allowing free riders, in other words, not allowing other countries who don't support it to take advantage of it, but moving ahead with some of these international agreements that everybody believes are important. This was done once years ago on government procurement, worked well. But I think that's another place where TPA, could be narrowly applied, which is to get the WTO back in the game in a way that would help us and help other countries around the world to provide some leverage with regard to opening more markets through an international organization, the World Trade Organization.
Do you see those as complementary approaches, working with the bilateral agreements that you mentioned, places like Vietnam and Kenya, or the WTO, or are those substitutes trying different paths to the same end?
Well, it's a good question, and they could be separate paths, although I've always believed that the multilateral agreements like Doha round are going to be difficult. Having spent some time working on that agreement and hoping we could get it across the finish line, 15 years ago, it never has. And so after years and years and hundreds and, millions of hours of debate, maybe time to figure out how do we do regional agreements, how do we do, in plurilateral agreements. It might not be regional, it might be cross regions, but we just need to move on an agenda. And by not doing so, you'll see more bilateral agreements with China, more bilateral agreements with other countries with whom we are competing, and the United States gets left behind. So let's move on all fronts, but let's be sure that these agreements are in the interest of the United States. I think this is something we can sell to the American people so easily because nobody wants to be left out. We don't want to be a country that can't compete because other countries are lowering barriers and trading more efficiently and improving their economy. We also can point to the fact that a lot of jobs have been created by exports. We need to also be sure imports are fair. So by tightening up the rules on the import side, putting in legislation that deals with some of the practices that are currently being deployed by places like China through their Belt and Road Initiative, where they're subsidizing third countries, manufacturing as an example, which is not fair, or through their own subsidization of their own products or selling them below market, or other ways in which they unfairly intervene in their non-market economy. I think that would lead to people saying, okay, this makes sense. Let's provide more trade, but let's do it in a balanced way.
That's an interesting, inspirational approach. I wanted to pick up on some of the facets of the current administration's trade policy. You've already talked a little bit about IPEF and whether that'll work. They often define their policy, if you listen to Ambassador Tai, for example, as it's a worker-centric trade policy. And I'm skipping ahead a bit here. So you went and negotiated a bunch of trade agreements that, things like the CAFTA. Did you see those as worker-centric when you were doing them, or is this actually a shift in U.S. trade policy? How do you interpret worker-centric?
You know, I like Catherine Tai. I supported her nomination and tried to work with her. But I don't disagree with anything she says, but I don't get it why you would stop trading if if you wanted to be worker-centric. I mean, where workers benefit is when they have the opportunity to sell their products made in America all over the world. You know, we're 25% of the world's economy, and only 5% of the population, something like that. And where we benefit is when we get access to other markets so that we can sell our agricultural product. The ranchers and farmers want that, so we can sell our manufactured products, so we can sell our services. And we're getting more competitive in terms of labor rates. We're getting more competitive in terms of automation and other technological innovations. We need the opportunity to spread our wings and to be more successful. I think about the companies in Ohio that I've worked with. We have one in Cincinnati, Ohio, my hometown, that I think they have about 100,000 or more workers around the world. They have about 14,000 in the Cincinnati area. And most of them have a job because of international sales. They wouldn't be there if not. So why wouldn't we want those markets? It creates jobs in America, good paying jobs. They pay on average 16% more and have better benefits. So again, I just point to the fact that half of our exports go to 10% of the world. That 10% is where we have a trade agreement. So what's worker-centric to me is helping workers. And I don't understand why it would be worker-centric to say that we just aren't going to engage with the rest of the world.
Fair point. Let me turn now, if I can. You've already raised it in a couple of contexts, mostly, another country striking trade agreements. But let's, if we can, take on U.S. trade with China. There have been a number of, bipartisan concerns, I think, about facets of that trade. We've gone through periods where we had limited barriers against China and extensive dialogue, and now we're currently in a prolonged period where we have extensive tariffs and perhaps less dialogue. How would you judge the efficacy of those two different approaches? Or maybe there's more than two, but how do we sort of address the concerns we have commercially with China?
Yeah. Well, I think as long as China's not playing by the rules, there has to be some consequence. And so I don't oppose putting tariffs in place as long as they are based on unfairness. And that has to be stipulated, as the 301 report clearly identified. The subsidizations, the some low cost, and other practices, trade distorting practices by a non-market economy, justified doing something. What I don't support is some of the tariffs that were imposed on actually some of our allies as well, which were based on a so-called national security concern under the provisions of our trade law that allow you to do it without showing unfair trade. So the 232 cases is an example. So this is where I think we need to be careful. I think we need to ensure that we are being very clear with countries who are not playing by the rules, but what specifically we are referring to, and then put very targeted provisions in place that help to persuade them to do the right thing, which is to play by the rules and to be engaged in trade in a way that is fair to everybody. One of the challenges that we've had with some of the tariffs we put on China, in my view, is that they have come back to hurt us, in the sense that if you have a product that is only made in China and you put tariffs on that product, in some cases tariffs so high that it's not viable to use that product, and a U.S. company, as an example, that uses that as a part to make a bigger, more expensive product, and you're being damaged by that, it really is like shooting yourself in the foot. It's not hurting China as much as it's hurting us. So I think you need to have a process, a due process, where those entities that are being hurt by the tariffs because they cannot find the product here in the United States and it's not currently viable to produce that product here in the United States or in third countries, that they have an opportunity to be heard, and that there be some sort of a relief for those particular products. So I think targeted, I think based on a clear messaging as to why we're doing it, I think it's appropriate, Bill. What I don't think is appropriate is if we do it in a broad brush way without explaining ourselves, and doing so hurt a lot of U.S. companies, including some small companies in Ohio that have been hurt by the imposition of some of these tariffs.
Is there a threshold at which we say this hasn't worked or we need to modify the approach?
I think you constantly look at it. I mean, the ideal approach is that China changes its practices and stops sending, materials here. I mean, I look at the steel industry, I look at the concrete industry. I now look at, the quantum computing sectors and AI. I mean, it's shifting, but there needs to be a commitment by China, as an example, on steel, that they're not going to continue to produce much more steel than they need and try to corner the market and then dump it, in effect, in third countries, including the United States. So I think there is still room for us to have these discussions, and they need to be very straightforward. This is not about trying to hurt China. It's about trying to help the economies of all countries by playing by the rules.
Senator, all kinds of fascinating stuff here. Our time is limited. I wanted to close by asking you to look ahead a bit. You had made some mention of whether or not in the last election we heard much about trade. We didn't. Do you anticipate that we will hear much in this next upcoming general election? What should we hear? What will we hear?
Well, the world is increasingly interdependent, and even if we didn't do another trade agreement, still there would be more trade back and forth between countries. The question is whether our workers and our farmers and ranchers and service providers are going to be able to take advantage of that. And I think that's how I would hope that the presidential campaign, would focus on both sides to say, okay, we've tried, pulling back, that didn't work. We're getting a smaller share. Let's engage, and let's do it in a way that's good for American workers, farmers, service providers. Let's be sure we take advantage of these markets in the sense of being able to export more of our products there. Again, 10% of the world takes 50% of our exports right now. Let's grow more good-paying jobs through that. But let's also be sure, as the imports come in, that they are fairly traded. And let's, be more willing to take the current trade laws seriously and enforce them, and also adjust them some. I mentioned what's going on with regard to Belt and Road as an example. That requires some adjustment in our trade laws. There are proposals to do that. So I would hope that the presidential campaigns would take these up as a message that the American people, I think, if properly explained, would support strongly. But that wasn't your question. Your question was, is it going to happen? I don't know. I think, again, I'm sad to say that although unions, including industrial unions, supported the USMCA, it seems as though they also supported President Biden's commitment in the campaign, at that time Vice President Biden's commitment in the campaign, to say, no more FTAs, no more free trade agreements. And I don't quite get that, because they not only helped to write the USMCA, they supported it strongly in Congress, which is one reason it got a majority of members on both sides of the aisle. So I would hope that there would be a reconsideration of the current approach, but I can't tell you exactly how that's going to come out.
Thank you so much, Senator. Very much appreciate your time and your insights.
Thanks, Phil. Appreciate it.
That is the end of today's webinar. We are very grateful to Senator Portman for an excellent conversation. And thanks to all of you for attending. We will email out the slides and link to this recording tomorrow morning. There's also a short feedback survey available. Please take a moment to share your thoughts and feedback with the team so we can continue to curate great content for you. Thanks again and have a great day.